Have you ever wondered how close you are to crossing the line into your own moral abyss? That point where exemplary behavior can give way to a dark and disturbing side lurking in the depths of society? Imagine the following scenario. You're sitting at your desk, trapped in the monotony of everyday life, when suddenly you find yourself in a situation where the rules of decency no longer apply. In that moment, would you still be the virtuous person you think you are? Or would you fall into the abyss, desperately struggling as you slide toward an inevitable fall? Recently, I came across a work that caught my attention, the book The Lucifer Effect by Philip Zimbardo. This book not only questions why good people turn bad, but also provides an uncomfortable, almost brutal answer. The evil might be closer to you than you imagine. Yes, to you. But before panic takes hold, let me guide you through this grim maze of human psychology. Buckle up. The journey will be intense. Let's begin by challenging the image you have of yourself. You, dear reader, probably see yourself as a good person. Perhaps you return lost wallets on the street or spend your free time volunteering at animal shelters. But let's be honest for a moment. Have you never given in to a small temptation because you knew no one would notice? Have you ever taken a pen from the office or used your neighbor's Wi-Fi without permission? The question is not casual. Zimbardo, with disarming clarity, shows us that evil is not a distant or incomprehensible entity. It begins subtly with small transgressions that seem harmless but gradually push us down a dangerous path. Think of the case of Ivan Frederick, a man who might be unknown to you, but whose story deserves to be heard. Frederick was a typical American, one of those who grew up playing baseball and enjoying his mother's apple pie. However, he ended up in Abu Ghraib, the infamous prison in Iraq, where unimaginable acts of cruelty were carried out against prisoners. The shocking detail is that before being sent there, Frederick was an ordinary person with no history of violence or monstrous tendencies. He had an average IQ, was mentally stable, and was deeply patriotic. But the atmosphere at Abu Ghraib transformed him into something he never imagined being. And if you believe your reality is different, prepare for an unpleasant awakening. The reality is that the line between good and evil is far thinner than you'd like to admit. You might still cling to the comforting idea that you are fundamentally a good person, but beware. You see yourself as someone intrinsically good, believing your personality is as fixed as the stars in the sky. However, let me undo that illusion. The notion that your character is immutable, that your essence remains unchanged regardless of the situation, is nothing more than fiction. Philip Zimbardo introduces us to the situational perspective, an approach that is both liberating and terrifying. Your identity is not carved in stone but written in the sand, constantly shaped by the environment around you. Think about this. How do you act with your friends compared to when you interact with a child? Are you really the same in both situations? Of course, you're not. Now let's go a bit further. Imagine you're part of the Milgram experiment, one of the most disturbing and emblematic studies on human nature. You take on the role of the teacher, and you must administer increasingly intense electric shocks to a student every time they make a mistake. The shocks start mild, but soon they reach levels that could be fatal, up to 450 volts. The student screams, pleads for you to stop, but you continue. Why? Because an authority figure in a white coat instructs you to do so. Incredibly, 65% of the participants, ordinary people like you, reached the maximum voltage. They weren't sadists. They were normal individuals molded by the pressure of the situation and obedience to authority. Zimbardo warns us powerfully that under the right, or perhaps the wrong circumstances, anyone can become an agent of cruelty. If you're still with me, let's dive deeper into this topic. Zimbardo didn't just theorize about this. He put his ideas to the test by conducting one of the most controversial psychology experiments, the infamous Stanford Prison Experiment. Now imagine this: 24 healthy, middle-class college students with no history of psychological issues are placed in a simulated prison. Half of them are designated as guards, while the other half take on the role of prisoners. The guards are given uniforms, batons, and dark glasses that hide their eyes, dehumanizing them. The prisoners, for their part, are stripped, disinfected, and begin to be identified by numbers, losing their personal identity. What begins as a simulation soon turns into a true psychological nightmare. The guards, initially just ordinary young men, begin to abuse their power. They force prisoners to urinate in buckets, make them strip naked, and even lock them in small closets as punishment. One of the guards, known as John Wayne, was especially cruel in his methods. All of this happened in just 6 days. 6 days were enough for Zimbardo to decide to end the experiment. And what is the lesson? Under the right conditions, human morality can crumble faster than a sandcastle in the middle of a hurricane. You may believe you would act differently in such a situation, but do you really know? What makes some people, like the Stanford guards, succumb to chaos while others maintain their sanity? Zimbardo suggests that one of the most dangerous ingredients in this equation is obedience to authority. Whether it's a person, an institution, or a set of rules, authority can lead even the most ethical to commit atrocities. Let's return to the Milgram experiment for a moment. The participants weren't evil people. They simply followed orders, convinced that they were contributing to a greater good. This tendency toward obedience didn't begin with Milgram, and it certainly didn't end there. Just remember the tragic Jonestown massacre, where Jim Jones, a charismatic leader who initially preached utopian ideals, gradually became a tyrant. His followers didn't notice the transformation. They trusted him and obeyed him until they were offered cyanide-laced Kool-Aid. More than 900 people died that day, not because they were bad, but because they were obedient. So here's a question for you to reflect on. How many times have you followed an order, not because you believed it was the right decision, but simply because it was the easiest path? How often do you challenge the authorities around you, or do you just assume they know what's best? Perhaps it's time to start asking yourself these uncomfortable questions before you find yourself sinking up to your neck in a moral swamp. But the problem with authority doesn't end there. The journey toward evil has another furtive accomplice: the loss of personal responsibility. Imagine being in the Milgram experiment, your hand hovering over the button, increasing the voltage while the student in the next room screams in pain. But you don't have to worry, right? After all, the man in the white coat said he would take full responsibility. So if something goes wrong, it's not your fault, right? This phenomenon, known as de-individuation, is incredibly dangerous. It's the same mechanism that makes people in crowds wear masks, soldiers wear uniforms, and online aggressors hide behind anonymous profiles. When you believe your actions can't be traced back to you, it's terrifyingly easy to abandon the brakes of morality. Zimbardo conducted a practical experiment to demonstrate this startlingly. He left an abandoned car in the Bronx, a place where anonymity reigns. Within hours, the car was completely destroyed and looted. In contrast, an identical car was left in Palo Alto, a more tight-knit community where people recognize each other. There, the car remained untouched, as though invisible. This serves as a powerful reminder that when anonymity enters the scene and responsibility is shifted, evil finds fertile ground to flourish. How many of you, hidden behind your screens, have said or done something you would never do in real life? It's easy to hide, easy to become someone different when no one is watching. But that person in the shadows is someone you wouldn't want to face in the mirror. Furthermore, there's the final blow to empathy. How do you convince someone to commit atrocities against another? The answer is simple. Convince them that the other is not truly human. This psychological trick justified some of the worst horrors in history. Zimbardo cites an alarming study conducted by Albert Bandura at Stanford, where students were assigned the task of overseeing and punishing another group based on their decisions. The difference? The punishers heard conversations where the opposing group was described in dehumanizing terms, being called animals and savages. Unsurprisingly, the punishments inflicted on that group were significantly harsher than those imposed on another group described as caring and understanding. This is the same distorted logic that underpinned the Nanking massacre, where Japanese soldiers, by dehumanizing Chinese civilians, unleashed unprecedented brutality. You might want to believe that this kind of dehumanization is a thing of the past, or that it only resides in the minds of evil people. However, just look around today's world. How often do you hear someone called an animal, scum, or worm? Once those labels are applied, it's surprisingly easy to ignore the suffering of others and justify cruel acts. Here's the terrifying truth. The moment you stop seeing someone as fully human is the exact moment you open the door to your own dark side. And it gets worse. As the saying goes, words can be as dangerous as weapons, and when used skillfully, they can disguise even the most atrocious actions. Enter euphemistic language, a subtle, polished vocabulary that turns torture into enhanced interrogation and genocide into ethnic cleansing. It's like sweeping blood under the rug. Zimbardo explores how this softened language and powerful ideologies create narratives that mask malevolent acts, allowing those responsible to sleep soundly at night. In the Milgram experiment, for example, participants were led to believe they were contributing to science and helping improve memory, when in reality they were inflicting pain on another human being. Fast forward to more recent times, and the same pattern repeats. The U.S. invasion of Iraq and the tortures at Abu Ghraib were not presented as atrocities, but as necessary actions in the fight against terrorism, justified as necessary evils to protect national security. Soldiers immersed in this ideological narrative believed they were doing good, even while committing acts that would be condemned worldwide. It's a grim reminder. When narratives are manipulated and language softened, the evil that emerges can be rationalized, justified, and even celebrated. The next time you hear someone distorting words to make something cruel seem virtuous, ask yourself what's really going on behind that polished rhetoric. We shouldn't think of evil as something abstract or distant. It's not just a grand tale of monsters and demons. Evil is something that starts small, something that begins with the choices we make each day, in the smallest moments, under the pressure of authority, the loss of personal responsibility, and the dehumanization of others. And while it might be uncomfortable to face the reality of our potential for evil, it is precisely in this uncomfortable space that we can begin to make better choices, challenge our own biases, and reflect on the power structures that shape our world. We all have the capacity to slip into the abyss, but we also have the power to resist, to stop ourselves before it's too late. The human capacity for evil is not an abstract concept or something that applies only to history's most notorious villains. It resides within each of us, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right or perhaps wrong circumstances to bring it to light. In that sense, we all walk a thin line between goodness and monstrousness. The key question then becomes, what will we do when faced with situations that challenge our moral compass? One of the most chilling ideas from Zimbardo's work is the realization that people don't just slip into evil, they are often transformed by their environments, their roles, and the psychological forces at play. In other words, we are more susceptible to becoming monsters than we like to admit. But it's not just because of something innate within us. It's also because of the situations we find ourselves in. The power dynamics, the peer pressure, the rationalizations we use to justify our actions. Take, for example, the concept of groupthink, a phenomenon where individuals suppress their own beliefs and moral judgments to align with the group consensus. This can lead people to make decisions that they would never have considered on their own. The pressure to conform can be overwhelming. And when people feel that they are part of a collective entity, their sense of individual responsibility often diminishes. They begin to see themselves as merely a cog in the machine, not personally accountable for the collective actions. This is precisely the reason why atrocities are often committed by groups, not just individuals. Whether it's a military unit carrying out war crimes, a political group oppressing minorities, or a corporation exploiting workers, the mechanisms that enable these actions are often psychological in nature. It's not about inherently bad people coming together, but rather about how a particular context, a certain ideology, or an unquestioned obedience to authority can mold ordinary people into perpetrators of harm. But here's the hopeful side of this grim reality. Recognizing the factors that make people vulnerable to moral collapse can also empower us to resist them. Zimbardo himself, after his study on the Stanford Prison Experiment, became a powerful advocate for the importance of awareness and intervention. He calls for individuals to take a more active role in questioning authority, breaking away from toxic group dynamics, and fostering a more empathetic and compassionate outlook. But how do we apply this in our everyday lives? How can we prevent ourselves from falling victim to the same psychological traps that have caused harm throughout history? The answer lies in self-awareness and vigilance. We must understand that we are all capable of slipping into harmful behaviors, but that we also have the capacity to choose differently. We can cultivate moral courage by consistently asking ourselves questions like, am I following the crowd or am I staying true to my values? Am I considering the consequences of my actions on others? Am I listening to my conscience or am I rationalizing my behavior to justify something wrong? Moreover, we must also be willing to hold others accountable, especially when they are in positions of power. It's easy to dismiss those in authority, whether it's a boss, a government official, or even a religious leader, as infallible. But as we've seen time and time again, power can corrupt. And when we blindly follow authority without questioning it, we risk becoming complicit in wrongdoing. As individuals, we also need to work to create environments that foster accountability and empathy. This is crucial in workplaces, schools, communities, and governments. In the absence of systems of accountability, dehumanization and cruelty can easily take root. We must resist the temptation to treat others as other, as somehow less deserving of respect and dignity. Whether it's through racism, sexism, or any other form of discrimination, when we allow ourselves to see others as less than human, we open the door for harm. Finally, it's essential that we continue to reflect on our own values, constantly refining and testing them. Are we living according to our ethical principles, or are we letting convenience, fear, or social pressure dictate our actions? If we are honest with ourselves, we'll admit that we often make compromises, sometimes small, sometimes large. But recognizing these moments of moral weakness is the first step toward correcting them. The road to preventing evil may seem long and challenging, but it starts with each of us. By acknowledging our vulnerabilities, by constantly checking our behavior and our justifications, and by standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, we can push back against the darker impulses that dwell within us. If you take away anything from this discussion, let it be this. Evil is not an external force that we are immune to. It is a potential that resides within us all. It is not the result of some inherent flaw, but rather the consequence of unchecked circumstances and unexamined choices. We are all capable of becoming monsters, just as we are capable of becoming heroes. The difference lies in the decisions we make when we are faced with temptation, pressure, and moral challenge. Let us choose wisely. Let us choose empathy over apathy, courage over obedience, and integrity over convenience. Let us build a world where the worst of us doesn't define us, but where our shared humanity shapes the future we create together. The darkness within us is real, but so is the light. As we move forward, it's crucial to consider that acknowledging our potential for wrongdoing doesn't make us weak or flawed, it makes us human. We are not defined by our mistakes or our capacity for harm, but by how we choose to respond when we are aware of those potential pitfalls. True strength lies in the recognition of our imperfections and the courage to act in ways that align with our higher principles, especially when no one is watching. One of the most powerful ways we can foster moral resilience is by engaging in ongoing self-reflection. Regularly checking in with ourselves about our motivations, biases, and actions ensures that we don't fall into automatic behaviors that go against our values. Just as we maintain our physical health through exercise and diet, our moral health requires attention and care. This practice helps us to identify when we are slipping into harmful patterns, whether it's by excusing behavior that we know is wrong or by failing to act when we see harm being done. We also need to build communities that value accountability. This doesn't just mean creating systems that punish bad behavior, but also fostering an environment where people feel supported in doing the right thing. The strength of a community lies in its capacity to lift up its members, to help them stay true to their values, and to protect them from slipping into toxic group dynamics. Communities where empathy, respect, and kindness are the norm make it harder for harmful behavior to take root. These communities encourage each other to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable or unpopular. One of the most impactful things we can do is to practice empathy and compassion. By seeing the humanity in others, we reduce the likelihood of dehumanizing them. The more we listen, understand, and appreciate the perspectives of others, the less likely we are to treat them with cruelty. Empathy is not just a moral choice, it is a psychological defense against the impulses that lead to evil. The simple act of acknowledging someone else's pain or joy helps us resist the temptations to exploit or harm them. This principle extends beyond interpersonal relationships. When we look at social structures, politics, and systems, it becomes clear that empathy is the foundation of justice. When we fail to empathize with the marginalized, the oppressed, and those who suffer, we create systems that perpetuate inequality and harm. In this sense, fighting for social justice isn't just about being nice or feeling good about helping others. It's about recognizing our shared humanity and rejecting the systems that enable evil to flourish. The beauty of this process is that it's ongoing. It's not about perfection, but about continual growth. Every time we face a difficult decision, we are presented with an opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to doing what's right. This could mean speaking out when we see injustice, taking responsibility for our own mistakes, or simply being more mindful in our everyday actions. But we must not delude ourselves into thinking that we can do it alone. It's essential to surround ourselves with people who challenge us, who remind us of our values, and who encourage us to be better. These relationships, built on mutual respect and shared ethics, form a protective network that can shield us from moral lapses. They can help us navigate the complex moral terrain we face daily, offering different perspectives, alternative solutions, and a sounding board when we feel uncertain. At a broader level, we need to advocate for institutions and systems that promote justice, equality, and accountability. No matter how much individual effort we put into moral development, we cannot ignore the societal structures that influence our behavior. A just society is one where individuals are held accountable for their actions, but also one where empathy is integrated into the fabric of decision-making. The laws and systems that govern us should reflect the values we want to see in the world, and they should be designed to uplift rather than harm. This involves critical thinking and the courage to question the status quo. Just because something is how things have always been doesn't mean it's right. History is full of instances where systems perpetuated evil for far too long before people spoke out and worked to change them. Progress requires the willingness to stand against the tide, to challenge authority when it's in the wrong, and to push for a world that values the well-being of all people, not just the privileged few. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of Zimbardo's work is that it underscores the potential for change. We are not doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past, nor are we slaves to our darker impulses. We have the capacity to evolve. By acknowledging the darker side of human nature, we gain the tools to prevent it from controlling us. Every act of kindness, every decision to act with integrity, every time we stand up for someone else, these are victories against the forces that seek to divide and destroy. In the end, this is not just about avoiding evil, but about choosing to embrace the good within ourselves, the good within others, and the good that we can create together. The struggle against evil is ongoing, but it's not a battle we fight alone. It's a collective effort, one that requires each of us to take responsibility for our actions and to work together to build a world where compassion, justice, and empathy prevail. The darkness may never fully disappear, but the light is stronger than we often give it credit for. By cultivating that light, by choosing to act with love and integrity, we can prevent evil from taking root in our lives and in the world. In doing so, we transform ourselves and the world around us, not by conquering evil, but by choosing to live by the better angels of our nature. Thank you for joining us on this transformative journey through the depths of knowledge. Remember, the pursuit of truth is not a destination, it's an ongoing quest, one that empowers us to rise above the shadows and embrace the light of understanding. Stay curious, stay bold, and keep expanding the boundaries of your mind. This is the Being of Knowledge, where wisdom and consciousness collide. Until next time, keep seeking, keep learning, and keep evolving. The adventure never ends.